Almost all horror movies end with the murderous force vanquished, even if it's only temporary, while a character or two lives to fight another day. Consequently, picking the right survivor is key to most horror movies' success. Get it wrong, and at worst you can taint the entire film, or at best leave an asterisk of disappointment over an otherwise quality horror flick. I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 horror movies that chose the wrong survivor. Number 10. Chris Higgins' Friday the 13th Part 3. Now you have to give Friday the 13th Part 3's final girl some measure of credit. Chris Higgins holds her own against Jason in the film's prolonged finale and exhibits a fair degree of resourcefulness throughout. However, she's also annoyingly hysterical and pretty cold as far as final girls go, such that she simply can't hold a candle to her franchise predecessors, the easy-to-root for, thoroughly likable Alice and Ginny. It would have been far more satisfying in this case to see the series' goofball prankster Sheldon Shelley Finkelstein survive along with the non-reciprocal object of his affection, Vera Sanchez. They were both warm, likable characters who would have made for an unconventional survivor pairing, but sadly it wasn't to be, as Shelley gets his throat cut and Vera catches a spear gun to the eye. Number 9. Bobby Dagan, Saw the Final Chapter. Saw the Final Chapter's central game revolves around fraudulent self-help guru Bobby Dagan, who is tasked with helping several friends and colleagues escape a series of gnarly traps in order to reach his imprisoned wife Joyce. Bobby's quest, however, is mostly a bloody failure, and his final test to save Joyce requires him to put hooks through his pectoral muscles and lift himself up, the very same test that he cooked up as part of his fake Jigsaw survivor story. Bobby, of course, ends up falling to the ground while attempting to replicate his pretend trap, resulting in his poor wife being cooked alive inside an ancient torture device known as the Brazen Bull. While you can argue that Bobby ultimately suffered a fate worse than death by watching his wife die so horribly, considering that Joyce is one of the series' most unambiguously innocent characters and absolutely did not deserve her position, it is still a raw deal that she died in his place. Given that Bobby was a slimy charlatan, it would have been far more satisfying to see him brutally killed while Joyce watches and lives. Obviously, Saw has always been brutal and hopeless, but a bit of catharsis does go a long way. Number 8. Rocky, Don't Breathe. The sole survivor of the three young thieves in the sublime horror thriller Don't Breathe is Rocky, played by Jane Levy, who manages to scarcely fend off blind Gulf War veteran Norman Nordstrom, who is tragically wasting that name not being a superhero by the way, and escaped to Los Angeles with her sister. While one can appreciate the desire to have Nordstrom face off against the central female character given the extent of his lurid crimes against women in the film, Rocky just wasn't a particularly interesting or appealing character despite actor Jane Levy being as great as ever. Granted, none of the three central youngsters are initially likable either, despite their understandable personal issues, though one of the three certainly stands out as the scrappy underdog. Unlike Rocky and Money, Alex actually appears to grow a little as a character throughout the film, and more importantly, proves himself far smarter than either of his friends in his attempts to survive. He also gets his ass kicked throughout the film and keeps on coming back until he's finally put down by a bullet from Nordstrom's gun. Number 7. Tommy Doyle, Halloween, The Curse of Michael Myers. The sixth Halloween movie is unquestionably one of the series' worst, and to that end fittingly features perhaps the lamest batch of survivors in the franchise. Though several characters make it to the end in one piece, Kara Strode, her 6-year-old son Danny, and Jamie Lloyd's infant son, the main survivor of the movie is Tommy Doyle, who Laurie Strode of course babysat back in the original Halloween film. Beyond the fact that, and it absolutely pains me to say this by the way, actor Paul Rudd does not give a good performance as Doyle in his first starring movie role admittedly, the script also just doesn't deliver on the potential of Tommy's return. It is never a story that justifies why we're focused on this character in particular. And that's made worse because the far more deserving protagonist was right there, you know, fan favorite character and Michael Myers' niece, Jamie Lloyd. Though Jamie does appear in the film, she's killed 20 minutes in, and to rub salt into the wound, the part was recast with another actress, J.C. Brandy, because the production gave Danielle Harris a lowball offer to reprise her role. The idea of an adult Jamie Lloyd taking on Michael Myers had such awesome potential, but the filmmakers decided instead to dispose of her in infuriatingly perfunctory fashion and focus on Tommy instead. Switch their screen time around though and you're completely golden. Number 6. Robert Morse, Alien 3. If you ask me, Alien 3 is an interesting example, because a lot of people actually forget that after Ripley hurls herself into a furnace in order to kill the ready-to-burst xenomorph queen, prisoner Robert Morse is effectively the last man standing. I know, right? I bet you totally forgot who this dude even was. Though Morse is attacked by Weyland Yutani operatives, he's still very much among the living when taken into their custody at the end of the film, even if he's never mentioned again in any subsequent movie. However, according to the wider canon, and this is just one for you guys, he was transferred to a C-class prison and died of natural causes almost 30 years later, so not bad for a character you probably didn't care enough to Google. Now, nothing against Morse here, but he absolutely isn't the character most fans wanted to see survive. If Ripley's sacrificial death made sense, it would have been extremely fitting that Newt made it out alive. Sadly, deciding to kill off both Hicks and Newt at the start of the movie remains the series' single biggest dramatic trespass to date. Of course, given that Newt was Ripley's major dramatic tether, it would have made sense that she was simply wounded in the initial crash and made a recovery by the film's end, allowing her to mourn Ripley's death in an epilogue and bring the trilogy of films to a suitable close. Number 5. Zoe Davis, Escape Room. Two characters make it out of Escape Room in one piece, the troubled stock boy Ben and the bookish loner Zoe. From the moment she's introduced though, it's painfully clear that Zoe is going to be the final girl, and for a film so thoroughly concerned with puzzles, it's a shame that no attempt is made to subvert such conventional signposting. Zoe is a smart and serious character, but also not nearly as gutsy or interesting as PTSD-addled war veteran Amanda, whose toughness amid considerable adversity makes her far easier to root for. Sadly, Amanda falls to her death in the upside-down escape room at the end of the second act, leaving two relatively generic younger characters to make it to the finish line, presumably because this is a PG-13 movie and the filmmakers didn't want to risk alienating younger audiences by killing off the young'uns. Number 4. Alice, Resident Evil. Paul W.S. Anderson's Resident Evil is a pretty fun B-movie if you don't take it too seriously, even if it ultimately doesn't feel all that much like the video games that inspired it. Most egregiously though, none of the game's central characters are actually featured in this first film, with the sole survivor protagonist instead being an entirely original character called Alice. Now, actor Mila Jovovich does a fine job in the role, but it would have been an awesome bait and switch to have the more obviously Resident Evil-esque of the movie's characters, Rain, survive. Given that Rain is an Umbrella Commando, she feels far more like a Resident Evil video game protagonist than Alice. And then, who knows, with Alice gone, maybe some of the actual video game characters could have gotten something to do in the sequels. All in all, Alice defied the odds to carry the franchise through a staggering 6 installments, but it is fun to consider just how different it would have been with Rodriguez's more appealing, no-nonsense badass soldier at the helm. Number 3. Paxton Rodriguez, Hostel. While it's clear that Eli Roth sought to toy with the audience's expectations in his torture porn film Hostel, that doesn't mean the subversion itself was satisfactory. Case in point, the movie's sole survivor is the well-established douche canoe Paxton, the exasperatingly arrogant arsehole who becomes a little less of an arsehole over the course of the movie. Enduring a bout of torture tends to do that to people after all. Horror fans are basically trained to expect the most virtuous character to be the last person standing in these movies, who in this case was Paxton's pal Josh. Yeah, I promise I'm not just choosing this guy to be the lead because, well, we share a name. That is definitely not what is going on here. Despite being a shy, genuinely nice guy and appearing to represent a gender flip of the final girl archetype, however, he ends up with his throat slit just halfway through the movie at the end of a painfully drawn out torture sequence. It also doesn't help that Paxton himself was made short work of in the sequel as well, getting decapitated in its prologue sequence. Number 2. Julie James, I Know What You Did Last Summer. Julie James may not be the sole survivor in I Know What You Did Last Summer. Ray also makes it to the end, but she is the movie's protagonist and neon signposted final girl. In addition to Jennifer Love Hewitt's so-so performance in the role, it's hard to care whether Julie lives or dies because she's not particularly likable or all that interesting. She's dismissive to her friend Helen, she makes little effort to avail herself throughout, and has to rely on Ray to rescue her during the finale. There is a far more suitable final girl stood right next to Julie though, the beauty queen Helen Shivers. While initially presented as a stereotypically vapid sidekick, Helen is by far the most developed character in the movie, aided by Sarah Michelle Gellar's impressively nuanced performance. Of course, sadly, Helen dies in infuriatingly stupid, if iconic fashion, while Mia feet from safety, but considering that she's the only fully formed character in the entire movie, she would have made for a far more compelling final girl than Julie. Number 1. Kate Ward, Army of the Dead. In the final moments of the film, Kate is forced to kill her turned father, and the other person who's not dead has been bitten and is presumably not long for this world. It's alright, but Kate as a sole survivor is both predictable and insanely dull, given that her various subplots help blow the film out to 148 patience testing minutes, and her actions throughout the film frequently endanger her survivors. The far more likable Scott and Vanderoe would have been infinitely more gratifying as survivors, rather than this one character who could have been cut out the film entirely.